long ago, I saw an army of rebels dancing on air. I dreamed as I slept, I could see the campfires, the song of a past that was born of the flame. The rebels were waltzing on the air. I danced with a girl to the tune of a waltz that was written to be danced on the battlefield. I danced to the tune of the voice of a voice that called, stand till you fall, stand till all the boys fall. So we danced to the rhythm of the gun. Through a glade, through the trees, I saw my only one. Then the earth seemed to rise, held hard as the sun. The soldiers were dying, there was a tune in the rhyme. The song was that old rebel wild. Came high from the fields, my eyes played trick through the moon and the trees. I slept as I dreamt, then I saw the armies rise. A voice began to call, stand till you fall. The song was that old gravel wild.
Good afternoon. I'm Anna Nelson, and I'm president of New Jersey Peace Action, and I welcome all of you to our 56th annual dinner. We are pleased that you could join us today to hear Jeremy Scahill speak on his newly released book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. We're also pleased to honor the work of Deputy Mayor Bob Russo and Councilwoman Renee Baskerville of Montclair. and our Peace Action Couple of the Year, Jane Califf and Ted Glick. Please be sure to stop by our literature table to sign the Moving the Money postcards and our other petitions, and that's over on the side of the room over here. And be sure to make note of the items on sale by Don and Lee Colt in the back of the room. We have a full program, so without further delay, let's get started. But before we start, if you have trouble hearing any of the speakers, please raise your hand and let us know. So thank you, and now on to our program.
This one? Hi, I'm Peggy Monges, and I'm so pleased to be able to make the presentation of the New Jersey Peace Action Couple of the Year Award to two outstanding people. They have been activists all of their lives, individually and as a married couple, for peace, justice, environmental justice, and an earth that will sustain humankind for generations to come. Can you hear me?
Keep talking.
Okay. In all their work, they make the link between climate crisis and war and the solutions to climate crisis and peace. I have been impressed over and over by their readiness to put themselves out there in the front lines to bring attention to the very real dangers facing us as our environment is degraded in the name of greed. Please read more about Jane Califf and Ted Glick in your journal. And now please give them both a big hand as they come up to the stage. Jane Califf and Ted Glick, this award is presented to you for your lifelong commitment to advocating for a more just, peaceful, and green world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peace Action. Ted and I are most appreciative of this award. We've been activists, as Peggy said, for a long time, and we came to this life choice through different paths. For me, it was the model of activism shown by my parents, Elaine and Joe Califf. And thus, when I was a child, they bought a 78 record for their children, little songs like Big Subjects, that had great songs like It Could Be a Wonderful World, which I sang so much, I still remember the lyrics. My parents' example, the songs, and the history I learned as a teenager and growing older made me want to work for a wonderful world. Ted's path began with religious parents who showed by example strong moral values. Even so, they were shocked when he burned his draft card, and shocked again when he later destroyed draft files to keep young men from being sent to the Vietnam War. He was sent to prison for 11 months for one of those actions. However, his parents came to support him in the end and to be proud that he acted on his moral principles. So through the years, we have been involved in movements for civil and human rights, peace, and now to address the dangers of climate change. Our efforts have gone beyond writing, rallies, and attending meetings to include civil disobedience, actions, and arrests, especially Ted. He will explain further.
Six years ago, Jane and I and Trish Comstock, who's here today, were arrested with 60 others on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. as part of a no war, no warming civil disobedience action. For years, the Essex Passaic Green Party has had a commitment to work for peace and justice as well as for a renewable energy revolution. The fact is that if the United States and the world do not soon get very serious about a transition to a planet powered by wind, solar, and geothermal energy as the primary and best renewable sources, we are facing escalating climate disruption, which will lead to wars over land, food, and water worldwide. Right now, our major work is against hydraulic fracturing of shale rock, fracking. In Essex County, work is going on to build a dangerous gas compressor station in Roseland and new pipelines to transport more fracked gas. We urge anyone who can to get involved in the growing movement in New Jersey against this, and there's flyers in the back. Thank you again to Peace Action for recognizing not just Jane and me, but the work of the Essex Passaic Green Party.
Good afternoon. I am Litza Binder, and I'm a board member of New Jersey Peace Action. I am very pleased today to present the Sylvia and Oscar Eichlsberg Peace Award to two local elected officials. I would like to ask Bob Russo and Renee Baskerville if they could come up, please. You must all be familiar with the phrase, all politics is local, coined by House Speaker Tip O'Neill. Well, Bob Russo and Renee Baskerville understand that phrase very well, and they use it to try to build a better community in Montclair. They both have been educators, Bob right now and Renee previously. And Bob is right now deputy mayor, former mayor of Montclair. And Renee is a physician, a pediatrician. And in her early life, she was a teacher. So they both know the importance of our children and the needs our children have in local communities. Bob has been a longtime member of New Jersey Peace Action. And he knows that the bloated defense budget affects the resources that are available in Montclair for education, police, fire, and public works. Renee Baskerville, Dr. Renee Baskerville, has had a very long career as a physician and as a teacher in Essex County. She believes and works to build a strong, loving relationship in the community, and she also supports moving the money from the federal budget to the needs of the community that the federal budget deprives us of to have at the local level. So both of these people, as elected officials, are trying to support a local resolution to move the money from defense to community needs. We are so pleased.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, my brothers and sisters. I am really humbled and honored to be here on this occasion. I'm particularly honored to receive this from New Jersey Peace Action because all of my underpinnings and my life's work as both a physician and a town councilor in Montclair are rooted in respect for the sanctity of human life and the building of strong, loving beings committed to peaceful coexistence in sustainable communities. I emphatically believe and teach by my words and deed that diplomacy and dialogue can move divergent factions in a household, in schools, in neighborhoods, and among nations to understanding tolerance and ecumenism. Harry Belafonte is quoted as having said, Midway through the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. realized that the struggle for integration would ultimately become a struggle for economic rights. I remember the last time we were together, he said, at my home shortly before he was murdered. He seemed to be quite agitated and preoccupied, and I asked him what the problem was. I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply, he said. We fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know that we will win. But I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house. Today, 50 years later, we're most definitely living in a burning house. When neighbors kill neighbors over dog poop on their front lawn, and mothers and fathers kill babies when they're tired of hearing them cry out as their natural means of communication, and when deranged people terrorize others in the peaceful enjoyment of the freedom to which they are entitled to in their homeland to make political statements, we are in a burning house. We're living in a burning house, and my walk includes extinguishing the fires and letting every man, woman, and child understand that we're all interdependent and we are our brothers and sisters' keepers. That I will do all that I can and never stop to let everyone know that we ought to be and we all should be working collectively as one. I can never be what I ought to be until everyone realizes and strives to be the best that they can. Let's move the money and let's put this fire out. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Part of the reason I'm here today is starting with Trish Comstock and Dorothy Eldridge, who was the founder of New Jersey Sane at the time, Peter Schuchter and Al Swenson, all working out of that great office on Bloomfield Avenue in Montclair until the rent got too high that you had to move to Bloomfield. But all those folks started me out in the 70s as a member of New Jersey Sane at the time. Now, we still have in our title, New Jersey Peace Action for a Sane World, but I remember that the idea was that it's insane to do what we're doing. It's insane to be spending all of our money on the military and on weapons of mass destruction, which we hope will never be used again. But this Move the Money campaign inspired me to talk to my students at Montclair State in urban education about what the problems are for cities. We're studying cities like Detroit and Atlanta and New York, and Newark and Jersey City, and even small cities like Asbury Park. My students now understand, after reading material from New Jersey Sane and from New Jersey Peace Action, I'll still say Sane, that we have a problem with where the money is. We're not broke. There is a film called We're Not Broke, which some of you may have seen. We have lots of money in this country. Look at the money that's spent on everything except education and health care and all the problems and needs we have. But we're not broke, but we're having our money taken by people who are greedy. And we have people like Facebook, which of course I'm on, and I shouldn't be on it because I like to protest them, but they pay no taxes. In fact, they take a $500 million credit on their taxes. And then the guy gives money to the city of Newark, which is only to give teachers a hard time. Now, I'm an AFT member, and as an AFT leader, thank you. As an AFT leader, years ago, I joined the ranks of people like my good friend Ted Glick because they arrested 200 of us in the Newark streets for a teacher strike to get our salary up from $6,000 to $9,000. Now, that was a long time ago, but still, we made $6,000 as starting teachers. So I immediately joined the NTU and AFT, and eventually I got into New Jersey Sane. And I realized there's a link. Teachers don't get paid, schools don't get fixed, books don't get ordered because the money is going to the wrong place. So why do we have these problems? As Councilor Baskerville said, we need to move the money. Now, I have a 94-year-old mom. I was there just before I got here, and I have to go back and take care of her. She can't get certain care and coverage because there's certain limits, and the government can't provide for a 94-year-old woman a little help. Okay, why? Because the money's going to the wrong place. So we need to move the money for a person like my 94-year-old mother. And we need to move the money for our schools. The problem in our schools, and the statement Renee knows I made at the council meeting a couple of months ago, which I think was distributed in New Jersey Peace Action's literature, is that there's no money for special ed anywhere near what they promised in 1970s, the IDEA Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education. We all want to help children with special needs. I have an autistic nephew. Well, why do we have a problem? Why are all the property taxes high? Because special ed takes up 1/4 of the budget, and 1/4 of the budget should be funded 40% by the federal government according to the IDEA Act, and they only fund 11%. They don't fund anywhere near the 40% they mandated. So we do the special ed services for children in Montclair and other communities, but we don't get any aid from the national government. Why? Because it's going to the wrong place, so we need to move the money for education. We need to move it for health care, for education. And there's one other thing I wanted to say. The police and firefighters that everybody's complaining are being laid off and there's not enough of them. Well, why don't we have that? Homeland security begins right in our communities. Why isn't the money there? Because it's being wasted. So we need to move the money for public safety, for public education, for public works, because our infrastructure is falling apart. We need to move the money back home to our communities, in the streets where people live. That's what we're going to keep working for. Thank you. That's mine. Is that yours? Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I'm Madeline Hoffman, the Director of New Jersey Peace Action. And it's really great to see everybody here this afternoon to hear Jeremy Scahill speak about dirty wars. The world is a battlefield. And Bob Russo and Renee Baskerville pretty much gave my speech already. So I can speak a little bit less time because I know everybody wants to hear Jeremy, but we have a little business to conduct here as an organization first. Okay, so before I speak to you about the state of our organization, I would like to take a moment to honor those dedicated peace activists we lost this past year. Please look at the In Loving Memory page of the journal for our list. There's one additional longtime member we want to acknowledge, Edward Kessler. The work we do each and every day is one way we carry on their vision. Their activism is part of what inspires us all. So let's just take one moment or 30 seconds to honor them. Moment of silence. Okay, thank you. I also wanted to say that we have several people videotaping this event today, but one we've never had at any of our events, and I want to acknowledge them specifically, and that's Democracy Now! I think in a way, Democracy Now! Helped get Jeremy Scahill his start, and also Jeremy Scahill helped to put Democracy Now! On the map. They've started working together a long time ago, and they are continuing to work together, and we're honored that Democracy Now! Is here today. Oh, and after Jeremy speaks, his books are for sale in the back, and I'm sure he will sign them for you, so don't forget that. The timing of today's program couldn't have been any better. Not only was March 19th, 2013, the end of 10 long years in Iraq, years which continue, I'm afraid, but just a few days ago, all 5 living presidents gathered in Dallas at the site of the newly inaugurated George W. Bush Library. Predictably, the media went easy on George W. Bush, as if the 8 years of his presidency and the wars, the torture, the drones, the civil liberties violations never happened. The other 4 presidents who attended also sought ways to be positive about George W. Bush's presidency, all the while ignoring the fact that we and the Iraqi and Afghan people are still suffering from the human and financial costs of the wars. And our current president, President Obama, has continued many of the same practices. In the words, or let past violations continue without investigation. In the words of Bennett Zarofsky, taken from his Facebook page, Bennett, raise your hand in. Guantanamo must be closed and almost all of its prisoners immediately released. The editorial in the New York Times doesn't directly call the continued operation of Guantanamo a crime against humanity, but it plainly is. I have rarely felt as ashamed of our country as I did yesterday, as all 5 living presidents gathered for the opening of the George W. Bush Library, and the hunger strike continues in Guantanamo. Remember last year we had James Yee here as our speaker, a former Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay Prison. And we continue our efforts since then to work for closure of Guantanamo Bay Prison. We heard very moving and emotional stories from James Yee last year. In this past year, New Jersey Peace Action has been very, very busy. Our efforts enabled us to hire and retain Jessica Camacho. We hired her as our Peace Voter Coordinator, and she's been retained as a Legislative Coordinator. We hired a development associate in Myrna Markarian, who was playing music for you earlier, multi-talented that is, and a website consultant, Tom Bias. Where is he? Okay. We had 2 work-study interns from Bloomfield College, 1 intern from William Patterson College. Our college interns and volunteers add so much to our organization, both in energy and spirit, but also in their desire to know more and act more to create a better world. In fact, in honor of the work New Jersey Peace Action is doing with Bloomfield College students, Bloomfield College recently presented us with a Community Recognition Award. We are so glad that there are 8 students here today from Bloomfield College, and also that our student intern from William Patterson is here. Raise your hands, everyone. And we also want to recognize Charles Nolly, who is a former Tuskegee Airman, who's sitting right there. Who worked with us to help make sure these students could attend our dinner today. We want to thank him very much for that. So New Jersey Peace Action has spoken at a lot of other colleges this year as well. We were at FDU Madison and FDU Teaneck. We set up a table at an environmental fair at William Patterson and a Get to Know the Community Fair at Montclair State. In fact, we must have tabled at approximately 15 street fairs and festivals since our last dinner, and would like to repeat that again this year. If you'd like to help, please fill out the volunteer form in your journal and leave it at your place or drop it off at the NJPA literature table in the back. If you open up your journal to the centerfold, you'll see the volunteer form right there, and we would hope that you would fill it out. We also visited our legislators several times in the past year. We met with Representative Donald Payne Jr. to begin to establish a relationship with him after his father, Donald Payne Sr., died last year. We've met with aides to our senators to hand-deliver Move the Money postcards, expressing our opposition to the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and potential wars against Iran and Syria, which we must stop, we must prevent. And advocating for moving at least 25% of the military budget to programs that address community needs. Renee and Bob spoke eloquently about that. Also in your journal, there's a little handout. The administration has a plan to modernize, quote unquote, 400 B-61 bombs, nuclear bombs, at a cost that's $25 million per bomb, or a total cost of potentially $10.4 billion. And our own Representative Rodney Frelinghuysen in New Jersey is on the committee that will decide what to do about it. We have his phone number there in the packet. You can call him. He hasn't made his position known. We've also had a great year working to expand our peace site network. We've welcomed new peace sites and rededicated others. There's an upcoming event at Lakeland Unitarian Universalist Fellowship on June 8th, and there's some posters up about that. We'll also be rededicating the Unitarian Society of Ridgewood on May 5th. We have added an educational piece to our work with peace sites to help us name schools and universities as peace sites also. We are so excited to have Jeremy Scahill here today as part of the opening of his book tour. The U.S. Senate held a hearing last week on the use of drones and kill lists. The Constitution Project recently released a report on the use of torture, and yes, we did torture. We've had concerns about the blowback of U.S. foreign policy, the ongoing hunger strike at Guantanamo Bay Prison. And Jeremy will be sharing with us important information about the covert wars and overt wars waged by our government in recent years. We need to stop the direction of this destructive foreign policy, and our best chance is if we continue to work together to end the ongoing wars, prevent new wars, work to move the money from war to peace, and understand how we need to change our approach from fighting against one war at a time to seeing the bigger picture and understanding the strategies behind these wars. I think Jeremy's presentation will give us tremendous insight into that. Thanks again to everyone for attending, and now I turn it over to Howard Lipoff.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, Madeline. It is amazing how much has been accomplished by New Jersey Peace Action this year. None of it would have been possible without the hard work of you, Madeline, the office staff, and our dedicated volunteers. As Madeline mentioned, we have reached it. Thank you for the applause, but I only have 5 minutes, so I have a lot to say. As Madeline mentioned, we have reached an important milestone with the commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. For me personally, this year also marks the 10th anniversary of my joining the New Jersey Peace Action Board of Directors. This milestone got me thinking about the past 10 years. As we all remember, the peace movement worked tirelessly to prevent the Iraq War. There were many protests, including a historically large one when many of us went to Manhattan as the world said no to war. While we were unable to prevent a horrific war from taking place, we should remember that we were able to mobilize a large number of people in a short period of time, which told the world that many Americans did not support the violent policies of the neocons. 10 years ago, despite our efforts, a majority of Americans supported the Iraq War. Yet, thanks to the work of Peace Action and other progressive groups, public opinion changed dramatically very quickly. Before long, a majority of Americans were against the war and agreed that the troops should come home. This did not happen by chance, but by the peace movement consistently pointing out that there were no weapons of mass destruction and that the war was based on lies. Many times over the past decade, tensions have risen and we could have gone to war again. It might have happened in Iran or North Korea. Thanks to New Jersey Peace Action and other grassroots groups, our political leaders know there will be serious opposition to another war. New Jersey Peace Action needs to be ready to continue to lead the anti-war movement. We need to be even better prepared this time. We cannot wait until after the war starts to have the opinion polls show that the public knows that we are right. To be prepared for the struggles that will come, we must be adequately funded. Madeline told you about our visits to the legislators' offices, our Move the Money campaign, our developing relationships with local colleges, and tabling at events throughout the state. She mentioned the expansion of our peace sites and the educational programs at these sites. We can only take these actions if we can pay the rent on our office. We can only do these things if we can pay our staff. We can only do this if we can print photocopies, pay the phone bills, and be able to put ink in our printers. That is why we must once again appeal to you, our members and friends, to support New Jersey Peace Action. Many of you in this room have supported us generously in the past. You are a big reason New Jersey Peace Action has been around for 56 years, and the reason we are able to have Jeremy speak to us today. He will be sharing with us important information about the covert wars being waged by our government in recent years. We need to stop this destructive foreign policy. To do this, we need you to make a contribution today. Our goal is to raise $15,000 this afternoon. Some of you could write a check for $5,000. Others can write a $1,000 check. Many of us can afford to give a few $100 or $50 or $20. You might prefer to spread your payments to NJPA on a quarterly or monthly basis as one of our valued sustainers. But whatever it is that you can afford, we would greatly appreciate it. There are currently volunteers walking around with baskets. I don't see them. The guys stand up and walk around. Thank you. They're walking around now. Please fill out one of the pledge cards on your table and put it in a basket. You can put a check made payable to New Jersey Peace Action or cash into the basket. As a major donor to New Jersey Peace Action, I know that I always feel good when I write a check to NJPA. It is an opportunity for me to contribute to a cause I truly believe in. Please make your contribution today so that you can also feel the satisfaction of contributing to a cause that you truly believe in. Thank you. We also have 50-50 raffle tickets that are going around. Karen Long is walking around, and they're $2 a ticket, and I think 3 for $5. A great bargain. Please purchase them today, right now. Thank you.
We will now enjoy several minutes of music to write checks by. Please spend all the time writing all those zeros after your amount. No violin this time, just vocals? I'll have you know that Anna likes turtles.
Thank you.
I guess it's, if I knew the song about money. Give me money, money. The song's called You Belong to Me. Suddenly appear. The stars out in the sky. Every come by. You belong to me. You belong to me. Don't be shy. Just come and see with your eyes. With your side, won't you tell me that you agree you belong to me? I've traveled from the ocean to the sea. That the mountain top is playing you. You belong to me. You belong to me. Don't be shy. Just come see with your eyes, with your soul. Won't you tell me that you are real? You belong to me. Won't you tell me that you are real? That you belong to me.
Wait, I didn't think we were doing another one. You're not? That's fine, it's fine.
Okay, I can do the rest.
Play like 1 minute. Ron DeStefano. Play. She's gonna do 1 minute, then you're up.
of greens and blues. I've been on a Sunday, I set my sails. If you want to. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. You can still keep putting money in the basket. Our volunteers will still be going around. And I think you should all give yourselves a big round of applause for all the work that you do to make programs like this possible, to motivate speakers and people like Madeline Hoffman and Jeremy Scahill to do the kind of work that they do. I would ask Jeremy to come up on the stage right now. I want to be as brief as possible so we can hear from him as much as possible. I have a special award for Jeremy from New Jersey Peace Action, bestows upon Jeremy Scahill the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award for his unyielding and courageous efforts to reveal the truth about war and U.S. foreign policy. Jeremy Scahill.
Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to be here with all of you, and my deepest gratitude to Peace Action New Jersey for all of the great organizing and activism and empathy and humanity that you've shown over all of these decades. There are people in this room whose work for justice predates my birth, and I'm just honored to be with all of you who really are heroes. Are we okay here? I just came from Boston, Massachusetts. I was in Boston and Cambridge yesterday, and we did an event with Amy Goodman and Noam Chomsky at Harvard. And it was really my honor to be there with Amy and with Noam. You know, Amy Goodman was really my teacher and my mentor. And I got my start, yes. I still listen to Democracy Now! Or watch Democracy Now! Every day. But I was saying to Amy yesterday that I remember how we ended up working together. And I was working at a homeless shelter in D.C. Called the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and a lot of what I was doing there was washing floors or cleaning toilets or taking folks to the hospital or helping veterans try to get the paperwork together so that they could get the benefits that they were owed. And I spent a lot of time listening to talk radio while I was sitting in waiting rooms. And I remember hearing this woman on the radio, and I'd never heard of her before, and she was talking about how there were rebels in the mountains trying to overthrow the US-backed dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo. And I remember hearing an interview with Laurent Kabila that they played, and it was the time when the story was on the front page of the New York Times, and people were trying to interview Laurent Kabila, and then Amy broadcast an interview with him, and they were covering this undeclared war in Iraq that the Clinton administration was waging for pretty much the entire duration of his presidency. A lot of young people who grew up with George or came of age with George W. Bush as President of the United States don't remember that in the 1990s, the Clinton administration was a very militaristic, hawkish administration. The bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, the cruise missile attacks in Afghanistan, the 8 years of economic sanctions against Iraq, which really was like turning Iraq's hospitals into a death row for infants, all in an effort on paper to punish the dictator of Iraq, but in reality it was the Iraqi civilians who were paying the heaviest price. And then Clinton initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam under the guise of the so-called no-fly zones in the north and south of Iraq. And it was during that period when President Clinton was in office that I started to sort of open my eyes, and I had heard this woman on the radio talking about all of these things, and I had no idea who she was. And then I listened the next day, and I became an addict of what was called Democracy Now! And at the time it was on a couple dozen radio stations. In fact, when I first met Amy, she had just been thrown off of every station in the state of Pennsylvania for airing the commentaries of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And I remember thinking, I had never taken a journalism class in my life. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I remember thinking, I just want to be a part of whatever she's doing. And so I started to, you know, this was before the internet was the internet. I started to write her letters, and I never got a response. And I started to call WBAI, the radio station in New York that she was based at. And then eventually, I had moved to New York and was living and volunteering in New York, and I finally met Amy Goodman, and she looked a bit terrified, and she said, "Oh, you're the guy who keeps calling." And anyway, to make a long story short, I think that the times when I would say to Amy Goodman, you know, if you have a cat, I'll feed your cat, I'll wash your windows, I'll get you coffee if you drink coffee, I'll do anything. She eventually had to decide whether to get a restraining order against me or actually let me come in to volunteer on her show. And so my life as a journalist began by essentially being like a coffee runner for Amy Goodman, and I learned journalism as a trade, not as a way of having a career or making money, but the way that you study plumbing or carpentry. You're an apprentice, and it shaped the way that I view journalism, that it should be, our job is really to provide people with information that they can use to make decisions on what kind of a world they want to live in, or what kind of a society they want to live in, and what kind of image they want to project to the rest of the world, and what they want their nation's relationship with itself and with the outside to be. And I owe a great debt of gratitude to Amy Goodman for everything that she taught me. And I often talk about how Democracy Now! Really was my university, because I learned more from studying under Amy Goodman than I ever would have if I had pursued a master's degree in journalism. I've spent the last several years traveling to various countries where the United States is waging undeclared wars. I've spent a great deal of time in Yemen, where there's been expanded drone strikes and cruise missile strikes and covert action by the CIA's Special Activities Division, its paramilitary division. I was in Somalia, where you have U.S.-backed hit teams and warlords that are hunting down members of al-Shabaab, the Somali militant group that pledged its allegiance to al-Qaeda. I was in Afghanistan, where there are two wars. There's the conventional war that you see through the lens of the cameras of embedded journalists, and then there's another war hidden within it, which is a special operations war of attrition, where there is a kill list and there are night raids, and they've killed their way so far down that list that now you have mid and low level Taliban commanders or facilitators, they're called in the press releases, that have become the targets of the most elite force the U.S. has ever assembled in the form of the Joint Special Operations Command. And we have a reality right now, as we enter this second term of the Obama administration, where a very popular Democratic president, who is a constitutional lawyer by trade, has normalized, legitimized, attempted to legalize many of the most egregious aspects of what the Bush administration called its counterterrorism policy. And I don't believe for a minute that if John McCain had won the 2008 election, or if Mitt Romney had won the 2012 election, that you would see polls indicating that 70% of self-identified liberals support drone strikes, and that support erodes only slightly when the target in question is a U.S. citizen. I think that what's happened over these 5 years is that President Obama has sold a lot of liberals a bill of goods, that this is a smarter way of waging war, that it represents a drastic contrast from what happened during the 8 years of the Bush and Cheney administration. I remember on the third day that Barack Obama was in office, he issued a series of executive orders that he said were going to dismantle the Bush and Cheney war on terror apparatus. And those executive orders included shutting down Guantanamo, bringing an end to torture, stopping the use of secret prisons, black sites as they're called. And the new CIA director, Leon Panetta, in April of 2009, just a few months into Obama's administration, said that the CIA is now out of the business of secret prisons. The reality, though, is that the changes have largely been cosmetic or rhetorical. There is a backdoor use of secret prisons that continues. There's been a rebranding of torture, and there has been an expansion of covert wars. When I flew into Adenade Airport in Mogadishu in the summer of 2011, and we landed, I was with my friend and colleague Rick Rowley, who's the director of our film Dirty Wars, which will be out this summer. When we landed in that airport, at that time, there was fierce fighting in Mogadishu. It was seeing its worst fighting in years, and it's a country that was utterly destroyed by warlords and by the CIA and by covert action. And as we taxied on the runway, before we exited the airport, we noticed this big structure that looked like a brand new village that had been built right there at the airport. And it had these huge walls around it, and there were small hangars for aircraft, and there was a small cluster of buildings that looked like a small village, and it resembled to us what we had seen in Afghanistan, these forward operating bases, or FOBs as they're called. Except that it was interesting because the walls of it were sort of painted with an almost pink paint, and the Somalis called it the pink house. And when we left the airport and we liaised with our Somali contacts who were going to help us get around the war-torn city of Mogadishu, I asked my Somali friend Bashir, what is that compound that's at the airport? And he said, oh, that's Guantanamo. And I said, well, what do you mean it's Guantanamo? He goes, oh, that's where the Americans are. And it turns out, and as I continued to report in Mogadishu, I found Somali intelligence operatives from the very fragile US-backed government there that were liaising with the CIA. And I asked them what goes on in that building, and that's where these individuals were working, and they said that the CIA and US military intelligence had set up a counterterrorism center there. And they were paying, and this continues to this day, it's still there and still operational, lining up Somali agents and paying them $200 in cash each month to serve as a capture-kill force to go and hunt members of al-Shabaab. So under the Obama administration, the US set up a force of proxies that would conduct operations as part of an outsourced kill program inside of Somalia. I traveled around Mogadishu with a series of US-backed warlords, some of whom had been on the CIA payroll since 2002 and 2003. And at times, US special operations teams conduct actions inside of Somalia by helicopter where they gun down individuals that are on the kill list and then snatch their body and fly them back out to ships in the Arabian Sea. In some cases, they've abducted people who they believe have intelligence value, and they've held them for 2 months or more incommunicado in naval brigs. All of this is under the Obama administration. When I was in Somalia, I met a journalist who works for a major international news agency. He's a local guy, he's Somali. And he told me that a few months before I arrived, he had been abducted by Somali security forces for filming an operation that US-backed forces were conducting in Mogadishu, and he was put in a prison in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service, which is a US-supported and funded entity. And that when he was in this basement prison, which he said was infested with bed bugs, had no windows, and that prisoners are not given access to the outside world, that he saw white American intelligence operatives interrogating prisoners in this basement. And I began to look into what was going on there, and it turns out that the US is using this secret prison in the basement of Somalia's National Security Service as a backdoor way around President Obama's supposed ban on using black sites. This is the difference between the Bush era and the Obama era. when it comes to torture, black sites, rendition. In the time of Bush, the CIA would snatch the people themselves, put them on planes, and fly them to Thailand or Poland where the CIA had black sites. Under President Obama, US officials direct the Kenyan government, for instance, to snatch someone in Kenya that they're looking for, and then fly them from Wilson Airport to Adenade Airport in Somalia, and then put them in this prison where they're technically imprisoned by Somalis, and then the CIA has the ability to interrogate these individuals. So is there a difference between those two? Yes, there is a difference. Is it more than a dime's worth of difference? I would say no. In fact, the current Obama policy on rendition and on secret prisons is very similar to the program when it was initiated under President Clinton. A lot of people forget that the evils of the world didn't begin the day that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were sworn into office. A lot of the policies that were expanded by President Bush were initiated in some form under President Clinton. The Effective Anti-Death Penalty Act, Counterterrorism and Anti-Death Penalty Act, was passed and signed into law under President Clinton. It was the precursor to the Patriot Act. Regime change of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was solidified in 1998 when President Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act. The idea that you don't need an international consensus to act militarily was grounded in President Clinton's bombing for 78 days of Yugoslavia under the guise of protecting the Albanian population of Kosovo. There's a continuum from Democratic to Republican administrations. U.S. policy has largely been consistent. The dominant perception is that President Obama ended the Iraq War, but the reality is that the plan that was implemented by the Obama administration for Iraq was the plan that was on President Bush's desk the day that he left office. And don't believe for a moment that the war in Iraq is over. The CIA has escalated its paramilitary activity there. There are thousands of mercenaries that remain on the U.S. payroll based out of the largest embassy that any nation in world history has ever built. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is a city unto itself and will increasingly become a hub of covert action as the conventional drawdowns take place in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what I think is the most concerning aspect of this administration's policies is the so-called signature strikes that have been conducted in Pakistan and Yemen. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but a signature strike is a certain kind of a drone strike. You know, the conventional drone strike is that you have someone that's on the kill list that you believe is associated with Al-Qaeda or is someone from Al-Qaeda. It could be Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda, or it could be one of the heads of Al-Qaeda in East Africa, and you find out where they are and you go and you do the drone strike. And that's what I think most people think the drone program is about. But under this administration, we have this policy called signature strikes, which is that you don't even need to know, U.S. intelligence doesn't even need to know the specific identity of the people that they're trying to kill in Pakistan or in Yemen. You can create a pattern of life that says if people are military-aged males, if they're between the ages of 16 and 70, and they live in a certain region, and they've been in touch with certain individuals in any capacity, the U.S. doesn't need to know their identities, doesn't need to have any intelligence that they're involved with a terror plot, doesn't have to have any evidence that they've been involved with criminal activity or that they're plotting against the United States, that you can preemptively assume that they are terrorists and kill them. And the U.S. has done this repeatedly. It's the most sort of grotesque form of pre-crime, except that it's not even clear that these people will ever commit a crime because we don't even know their identities, much less any information about what they may or may not be involved with. And what I've seen in all of the countries that I've traveled to and all of the people that I've talked to in the areas being targeted by drone strikes or special operations night raids or cruise missile attacks is that the United States is inspiring more terrorists than it's killing in the pursuit of defending an airplane from being taken down, or a water supply being poisoned, or a subway being bombed, or an explosive being put in Times Square. When we are acting out of fear in this nation, we're acting out of fear of terrorism, which is minuscule compared to the other threats facing our country. Our economic situation presents a far greater threat to our population than any lone wolf terrorist, and yet we pour billions of dollars into the pursuit of a few hundred people around the world that are probably plotting on any given day to do something bad to an American citizen or to the United States as a nation. And we're operating out of fear. We're operating out of fear because this has become the policy. Body counts are the metric by which success is measured on Capitol Hill in this so-called war on terror. For me, that signature strike policy, it should be the source of great shame for our society, because one of the fundamental rights that we're supposed to have is the right to a trial, the right to due process, the right to face our accusers, the right to have the evidence presented against us so that we can see it, and a right to be judged by a jury of our peers. And what we've seen is a line crossed that I don't think you can walk back from anytime soon, in that US citizens have now been put on the kill list and have been targeted for assassination. The phrase targeted killing, which I use myself, is not an appropriate phrase. What we're doing is assassinating people around the world. In some cases, we're assassinating them for who they might one day become, and not for what they've already done. On September 30th, 2011, President Obama was presented with intelligence that indicated that a high-value target who was on the kill list, that his location had been identified in the village of Kashef in northern Yemen. And this individual was an American citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki. And Anwar al-Awlaki's story is a fascinating one to me, and I think to people who knew who he was, because I remember as a young journalist seeing him on television after 9/11. He was an American citizen who was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. His father had come to the United States in 1966 as a Fulbright scholar, got a number of degrees from New Mexico State and other universities, and is a very upstanding citizen of Yemen who helped build up the Department of Agricultural Engineering at Sana'a University, adored the United States, still to this day adores the United States. His son Anwar was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, went to school in Colorado, and ultimately became an imam. And he was an imam at a mosque in San Diego, and then he was an imam at a large popular mosque in Virginia, the Dar al-Hijra Religious Center. And after 9/11, Anwar al-Awlaki, this American citizen who was an imam, became a media star, and I remember this. And he became a media star in the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times and on NPR and on PBS, because what he was saying is he was condemning the 9/11 attacks, and he was condemning al-Qaeda as individuals who were perverting Islam. And he was speaking about the experience of many American Muslims in the United States who were torn between being against what happened and horrified at what happened in New York City and Washington, D.C., but also feeling like their own government was turning on their religion and was waging a war not against terrorism but against Islam. And he was making sense of that experience in large corporate media outlets and was talking about the witch hunt against Muslims in our society and the detention of innocent Muslims in the pursuit of people that had plotted this attack on the other side of the globe, and at the same time condemning the 9/11 attacks. He had become such a prominent, recognized figure in American society after 9/11 that Anwar al-Awlaki was invited to speak at a luncheon at the Pentagon. And he attended that luncheon at the Pentagon, and he spoke to very senior U.S. officials about Islam in the world at the Pentagon. And there aren't many funny moments in my book, but I noted in that on the list, I got the list because it's been declassified, of what they served for lunch that day, and among the sandwich selections was a bacon sandwich, and I doubt that Imam Anwar al-Awlaki had a bacon sandwich, but it just shows you how good the intelligence was at the time in general. This is in the lead up to the Iraq War, that you serve bacon at an event about Islam where you have a prominent imam speaking at it. So Anwar al-Awlaki was this guy that I think spoke for many, certainly many Muslims, when he expressed his condemnation of the 9/11 attacks and also his outrage at the way Muslims were being treated in the world. And I could tell you the whole story of what happened to Anwar al-Awlaki, but I'll just summarize it because our time is limited today. He was a man who very much was radicalized by U.S. policy, who saw the wars in Iraq and saw the treatment and the abuse and the torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib and the shackling and detaining and the kidnapping of people who were then sent to the Guantanamo prison, or to the secret black sites in Poland or Thailand or elsewhere around the world. And he saw the detention of Muslims in the United States and felt that his religion was having a war waged against it by the most powerful nation in history. And eventually he decided to leave the United States, and he traveled to Britain, and then he went back to Yemen, where his father was a prominent politician, political figure, and the dean of this School of Agricultural Engineering. And he was trying to put his life together there, and he tried real estate, and it didn't go well, and he was taking classes at an Islamic university. And he started to record sermons, and they became very popular in the English-speaking Muslim world. And he became more and more sharp in his rhetoric against what the United States was doing in Iraq and elsewhere. And in 2006, he was arrested in Sana'a in Yemen on trumped-up charges of intervening in a tribal dispute, and he was put in prison on orders of the United States government. And he was in prison for 18 months, 17 of them in solitary confinement. And while he was in prison, he was interrogated by FBI agents who traveled to Sana'a to interview him. The United Nations investigated his imprisonment and declared it to be extra-legal imprisonment of Anwar al-Awlaki, and there was pressure from his tribe and from his family, very prominent people in Yemen, and eventually the US-backed dictator of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was forced to release him. And when he was released, John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence and a man who knows a fair deal about the dirty wars in Central America because he was a key player in them, met with Bandar Bush, the Saudi ambassador to the US, whose nickname is Bandar Bush because he's so close to the Bush family, and with Yemen's ambassador, and he told them, according to sources that I interviewed who were familiar with the meeting, that the US position was that they wanted Anwar al-Awlaki kept in prison for 4 years or more so that Muslims would forget about him, because they viewed him as a threat and someone who could inspire acts of lone wolf terrorism in the US or in other countries. So when al-Awlaki was released from prison, the Yemeni government was having pressure from the US government to rearrest him. And Anwar decided to go underground and live in the tribal land of his family in the province of Shebwa. And while he was there, he started a blog, and the internet became his mosque, and he would do mundane things like answer questions about, is it acceptable for Muslims to eat a certain kind of cheese if it's purchased in a big grocery store? Is it ever permissible for Muslims to take out a mortgage because of issues of usury? He would answer those kinds of questions, but he also started to answer questions about how Muslims should respond to the Israeli attacks on Gaza and how Muslims should respond to the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he wrote a blog post called Suicide or Martyrdom, which quite clearly, if you read it, advocated for suicide bombing and said that it was not prohibited by the religion. And he was getting more and more radical, and the US was trying to have his blog shut down. They were trying to have him rearrested. And then in 2009, in May of 2009, the head of Yemen's intelligence service came to the al-Awlaki family, and they told them, if you don't convince Anwar to come back to Sana'a, the capital, and let us put him back in jail, the Americans are going to kill him with a drone. So we know that as of May of 2009, the US government was telling Yemen's government that it intended to kill Anwar al-Awlaki if he was not put back in prison in silence. And when al-Awlaki's fate was sealed was in November of 2009, a few months after this, when Major Nadal Hassan opened fire on his fellow soldiers at the US military base in Fort Hood, Texas, and killed more than a dozen other soldiers, wounded many more, was paralyzed himself. Nadal Hassan had been in email touch with Anwar al-Awlaki, and stories were then floated in the press that Anwar al-Awlaki had been involved with plotting this massacre of US soldiers by, Nadal Hassan was an army psychiatrist, and he had been listening to the stories of soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and had internalized it and was contemplating killing them before they could go redeploy to Afghanistan. And so the stories came out that al-Awlaki had been involved with this. But when the emails between Nadal Hassan and al-Awlaki were declassified, it became clear that Hassan was this deranged guy, sort of a pathetic man stalking Anwar al-Awlaki. And there was nothing in it to indicate that al-Awlaki had anything to do with Fort Hood. And US intelligence, when they reviewed the emails, determined that he had nothing to do with it. But the mere fact that this man had been emailing Anwar al-Awlaki and asking Anwar al-Awlaki to find him a wife or saying, I want to give you a $5,000 prize, or I'm going to have an essay contest in your name. It was leaked into the media that al-Awlaki had something to do with it, and to this day it's mentioned when he's mentioned on television. Now, I don't know that al-Awlaki had anything to do with Nidal Hassan more than what we've seen in those letters, but there's never been evidence presented against him to suggest that. And then in December of 2009, December 25th, 2009, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, this young Nigerian guy, tried to blow up a US airplane, or an airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day. And it emerged that al-Awlaki had met with Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib when he was in Yemen. And so the US government began intensifying its hunt for al-Awlaki and started conducting drone strikes against him. And when the Washington Post published an article in January of 2010 about the growing US kill list, they revealed that Anwar al-Awlaki was in fact on the kill list. And so by my count, the US tried to kill Anwar al-Awlaki more than a dozen times. Now, Anwar al-Awlaki said things that I find deeply offensive as a human being. He called for the assassination of specific cartoonists who had drawn cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that I think were deeply offensive to many Muslims, but he called for their assassination. He listed the name of a young woman in Seattle, Washington, and said that people should go and shoot her. And she had to go into witness protection and go underground. And to this day, she doesn't have anything vaguely resembling a normal life because of the threat against her. I don't believe that Anwar al-Awlaki was some epic hero, or that he's necessarily even innocent of any of the things that have been leaked about him, because I don't have access to that intelligence. But I know this, that as a society, we are not judged on how we treat the wealthy, or the powerful, or the popular. We're judged on how we treat the poorest of our people, the least of our people, and the most reprehensible of our citizens. If Anwar al-Awlaki was a terrorist, and if Anwar al-Awlaki was involved with plotting against the United States to bring down airliners or poison water supplies, as was leaked in one story in a major US news outlet, indict him. Present the evidence against him. That's how our system is set up. We don't just have the posse go and round someone up and then hang them, or we're not supposed to anymore in this country. There was a time when that was how people were treated. And it's one of the most shameful periods in our nation's history. And yet we've somehow returned to this mentality that there are certain people for whom due process is not an option. And if that's who we want to be as a country, then we need to rewrite our Constitution. And we need to say, well, we're not the country we tell the rest of the world that we are. And so this man, Anwar al-Awlaki, who very well could have been indicted if they had that evidence against him, is now being targeted by his own government. His father then retains the services of the American Civil Liberties Union and the Center for Constitutional Rights to file a lawsuit against President Obama and CIA director and the Secretary of Defense, not saying my son is an innocent man, not saying my son is a hero, but saying, how is it that you can plot to assassinate my son without even presenting a shred of public evidence against him? And all of the most powerful figures in the US government, from the CIA, the White House, and the Pentagon, submitted briefs to the court when this lawsuit was filed. And they said, they told the judge, we have evidence against Anwar al-Awlaki that he is involved with active terror plots against the United States. But the evidence is too sensitive to present. They said that if the evidence against al-Awlaki had been presented in court, it would threaten the national security of the United States. And eventually their lawsuit was thrown out. And they hid behind the state secrets privilege, as George Bush did through the 8 years of his administration when people tried to challenge Guantanamo, tried to challenge the torture, tried to challenge the secret prisons. The same policy, which is to say, we have evidence, or this is the right thing to do, but we just can't prove it to you because it's bad for your health, or it would be bad for the health of the nation. And so eventually, the Obama administration tracks al-Awlaki down to a definitive location. And on September 30th, 2011, drones and other aircraft appear over this village, the house where Anwar al-Awlaki was. And al-Awlaki was there sharing that house with another American named Samir Khan, whose family is originally of Pakistani descent, and they're living in North Carolina, and I know that family as well. The FBI had told the Khan family that Samir Khan wasn't charged with any crime. They knew he was in Yemen. They wanted his family to ask him to come home, but that he hadn't been indicted. And his parents said, well, if my son hasn't committed a crime, are you his travel agent now that tells him where he can and can't go? And so he's with Anwar al-Awlaki in this house, and the two of them get into a car and they go out, and the drones are above them, and they launch a missile and blow up the car, and then they launch another one to ensure that they kill both of these individuals. And Obama that day, President Obama, was at Fort Myer in Virginia, and he didn't say the US conducted an operation that killed Anwar al-Awlaki like he did with Osama bin Laden. He just announced that Anwar al-Awlaki had been killed, and then he bestowed upon him a title that no one that covers these issues in the journalism community or people that interview al-Qaeda jihadists in Yemen had ever heard before, that al-Awlaki was the chief of external operations for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And so the president was announcing that this US citizen had been killed, and then we found out that Samir Khan was killed also in this attack, and one Republican congressman said, well, even if Samir Khan wasn't on the kill list, it's a bonus. It was a twofer, he called it. The reaction in Washington to the assassination of these two US citizens who had not been charged with any crime and not had any evidence presented against them publicly fell into two camps: silence or enthusiastic support. The enthusiastic support was bipartisan. John McCain and Hillary Clinton gave basically the same speech. Carl Levin and Dianne Feinstein gave essentially the same speech. Peter King, the Long Island congressman, could barely contain his enthusiasm for the operation and almost was jumping on a table screaming more, more, more. And then on the other hand, you had total silence from Democrats and Republicans alike. And I remember about almost 2 years before Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan were killed, one congressman, when we found out that al-Awlaki was on the US kill list, one congressman put forward a bill that didn't even mention al-Awlaki by name. It just said that the US government doesn't have a right to extrajudicially execute its citizens without trial. And that congressman was Dennis Kucinich, and only 6 people, 6 members of Congress, signed on to that bill, and not a single senator sponsored it. And it's because no one did anything about it before it happened, because the lawsuit that the family had filed just seeking to know what are the rules about assassinating our son, because there was silence, it was allowed to continue, and eventually we crossed that line of then assassinating US citizens. Well, Anwar al-Awlaki, when he was underground, he had left his children and his wife with his parents in Sana'a, and they all lived in the al-Awlaki family home. And I want to stress, because over the years I've gotten to know this family so well, that Nasser and Saleha al-Awlaki, the parents of Anwar al-Awlaki, are amazing, dignified, upstanding people who did not raise their son to be the guy in the camouflage jacket with the dagger in front of the black flag calling for attacks against the United States. That's not how they raised their son. Their son was transformed into what he became in large part because of the wars that were waged by George Bush and Dick Cheney. He was radicalized by the way that Muslims were treated around the world, by the invasions, by the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. And that family, when their son went underground, they took his children and they tried to raise them as well. And their dream was for Anwar's eldest son, Abdul Rahman, who was born in Denver, Colorado in August of 1995, was for him to go to university in the United States. And I got deep into the family's archives and saw all this video of Anwar's children, and you would never know for a moment that their father was one of the most wanted men in the world. They were totally normal kids. Abdul Rahman had this huge afro, and he had a Facebook page where he was into comics and video games and rap music and being an older brother to his younger siblings. And you see him playing karate with his friends in the street, and they're posing as rappers. And when the so-called Arab Spring was happening and it came to Yemen, he would spend his nights in Change Square with the nonviolent revolutionaries who were trying to bring down the US-backed dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And I got to know this family so well. And soon before Anwar al-Awlaki was killed in this drone strike, his son Abdul Rahman, who had just turned 16 a few days before, had snuck into his mom's bedroom early one morning and stole about $40, the equivalent of $40 from her purse. And he packed a small bag and he climbed out the kitchen window, and he had gone to Bab el Yemen, the old city in Sana'a, and he boarded a bus because he left a small note for his mom saying, "I'm sorry for taking the money, but I'm old enough now to do this on my own. I want to try to find my father." So he had gone to look for his father a few days after his 16th birthday. And he went to where he thought his dad was, this province I told you about before, Shebwa. And he was staying there with his cousins and other extended family, and that's when his father was killed. And his father was killed nowhere near him. He was killed in the north of Yemen. And after his father was killed, his grandmother, Saleha, called him at their relative's home, and she said, "Abdul Rahman, it's finished. Your father's dead. You have to come home." And Abdul Rahman said, "I will, but the roads are blocked because of the fighting and because of the revolution in the country." So he had to wait with his relatives there for the roads to clear up. And his cousins and his aunts and uncles were encouraging him to get out and have dinner or hang out with the other kids in the extended family. And on October 14th, 2011, 2 weeks after his father had been killed, he finally went out and he goes out with his cousin, his 17-year-old cousin Ahmed, and some friends, and they're sitting in an outdoor restaurant when a drone appears above them and launches a missile and blows up 16-year-old U.S. citizen Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki and his teenage cousins, who were all citizens of Yemen. And when this strike originally happened, and the U.S. military officials and White House officials leaked information, that's how everything is done now, it's just leaks. They leaked information. They said that Anwar al-Awlaki's son was 21 years old, and he was a militant, and he was a military-aged male. And then the family had to produce the birth certificate from the state of Colorado showing he had just turned 16 years old. And then another official said, well, he was at an Al-Qaeda meeting, and that's why he was killed. He was collateral damage because he was at an Al-Qaeda meeting. And then they said, well, he was meeting with this guy, Ibrahim al-Bana, who was a propagandist for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive right now, but 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki is dead. Who was the target that day? Can we believe that it's a coincidence that 2 weeks after this kid's father is killed, he just happens to be in an area nowhere near where his father was killed, having dinner with his cousins, and a drone just comes and blows him to pieces? It's an incredible, macabre coincidence if that's the case. After this killing happened of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, there was almost no discussion of it in the US media, in the immediate aftermath of it. But when Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, was on CNN being interviewed by Candy Crowley asked him about the president's policy of targeting American citizens, and she said, what about these 3 Americans that were killed in Yemen over this 2-week period? Anwar al-Awlaki, Samir Khan, and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. And Harry Reid said, I'm not going to get into all the classified details, but if there were 3 Americans that deserved to die, it was those 3. And I tried to pursue answers from Senator Harry Reid, who has access to intelligence because of his prominent position in the Senate, and I wrote to his office repeatedly. I was even openly going after him on Twitter and saying, do you really mean that 16-year-old boy deserved to die? Do you have any evidence that 16-year-old boy was a terrorist? Because I know that family and I know who that kid was. That kid was nothing even vaguely resembling a terrorist. That kid was a normal, lanky, goofy, adolescent kid. If you look at the photographs, and you can Google it, if you look at the photographs of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. He had this huge head of hair that his father and his mother, his grandmother and grandfather and mother were constantly telling him to cut. And he hadn't cut his hair because it was an act of teenage rebellion. And when his family found out that he had been killed, the relatives in this place where he had been bombed told them, we couldn't find much of Abdul Rahman, but we found part of his skull, and we knew it was him because of how big the hair was on the skull. That was what the grandparents were left with. They weren't even able to give these kids, all of the Abdul Rahman and his cousins, proper burials because they were blown to pieces. They vanished, these kids. The drone vanished them. So they had to bury them in one common grave. And I watched in horror as this story played out because I couldn't believe how deafening the silence was. That we are now at a position in this country where our popular democratic constitutional law professor president can assert the right to kill American citizens without trial and can conduct an operation, and I don't know what the point of that operation was. I think we all should demand an answer. Conduct an operation where a 16-year-old kid can be killed who's a citizen of the United States. On a moral level, it shouldn't matter whether you're an American or a non-American, but there are other legal issues that we have about this here. But the idea that can happen, and not a single reporter has ever asked the president about it, is shameful. It's a shameful commentary on our media culture, but also about the state of our dialogue in this nation. It cuts to the heart of a lot of issues for all of us, and we should care about it. When Robert Gibbs, who was the former White House spokesperson, was serving as a surrogate for the Obama campaign in the 2012 election, a very tenacious young reporter named Sierra Adamson, who's not a famous journalist at all, although maybe someday you'll hear about her, did what so many corporate journalists fail to do. She asked a real question, and she went up to Robert Gibbs after one of the debates between Romney and Obama, and she put a camera in his face and she said, "I want to ask you about the killing of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. He was a 16-year-old American citizen who was killed without due process." And Robert Gibbs shot back at her and said he should have had a more responsible father. If and you can see that if you want to check my facts and go on YouTube, and you can find it right there. And the reaction that I had when I saw that, my stomach just dropped and I felt disgusted. Because there are few things that you can do with your life that are more shameful than blaming the killing of a child on who their parents are or who their parents were. And that's what this man, who was speaking for the president at that time during his re-election campaign, said when asked about it. I've been pursuing answers as to why Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was killed since the week that it happened. A few weeks ago, I met a former very senior official from the Obama administration. He recently left the administration, and his job at the White House was working on the kill program. And I asked him about the killing of Abdul Rahman, and he said that when JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, and the CIA had briefed President Obama on the operation beforehand, that they had said that this guy, Ibrahim al-Bana, this AQAP guy, this al-Qaeda guy, was alone in that restaurant that they hit. And that after the president found out that al-Awlaki's son had been killed, that he was very upset about this, and that John Brennan believed that it was an intentional hit. Brennan is now, of course, the director of the CIA. Brennan believed that either JSOC or the CIA had intentionally killed Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, maybe based on false intelligence provided by the Yemeni government, the belief that he was 21. Maybe it was one of those signature strikes that I told you about, where there were just enough teenage men in one place in a certain area of Yemen, and therefore they became legitimate targets. But we won't know unless someone in a position of authority forces the White House to answer that question. And I continued to press this official, and I said, well, if it was a mistake, if that's what you guys are leaking all the time, one official called it an outrageous mistake, saying he was collateral damage, then why wouldn't you just say that? Why don't you own what you did and say that and offer something to that family? And he said to me, look, we had just killed 3 American citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets, Samir Khan and Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. That doesn't look good. It was embarrassing. So the most recent word we have on why there's been no explanation for this is that it would have been embarrassing for the White House to have to own it. I think that the way that we as human beings work is that in some part of our existence is that you can have the deaths of 400 people or 2,000 people, and it can go by as kind of just being a statistic. But unless we see the sort of humanity in other people and have empathy for who they are, we're not going to actually start to care. You know, I'm not going to say anything at all about the Boston Marathon bombing, about the suspects, because I think that all we know right now is leaks and what people are saying, and sometimes investigators will leak false information so that they can spur a reaction from someone else so they can see who they're going to call and talk to. Look at after the Osama bin Laden raid. almost everything John Brennan said happened in that room that day didn't happen. Osama bin Laden didn't use one of his wives as a human shield, but that was the story that was put out. Osama bin Laden wasn't reaching for a weapon, but that was the story that was put out. We need to learn that lesson as we watch what happened in Boston. Maybe they were motivated by the dominant story that's being leaked to the press right now. Maybe these were deranged people, like the kinds of people that shoot up elementary schools. We don't know, but what we do know is this. The one thing that the media, that journalists have done right in this, is they've covered the stories of the victims. We know of the incredible heroism of the first responders, people like Carlos Arredondo, who went and rescued this man who lost both of his legs. We've all seen that iconic picture of him rushing him in the wheelchair, trying to get him to safety as his legs have just been blown off and trying to save his life. We know the story of the 8-year-old boy who was killed, and I don't know how many of you have seen the picture of him holding the sign for peace, but it's heartbreaking. And you know about his dreams, and you know about his visions, and you know about what he wanted to do with his life, and we know about the young woman from China who was a graduate student. It's someone, I was with someone from China last night, and she told me that after President Obama mentioned that Chinese graduate student who died in Boston, his name, that on these Chinese blogs, they had started a comment stream that said, "Where you dies matter. Where you die matters." Meaning that President Obama would have never been saying the name of this Chinese woman had she not been killed in Boston, had it happened somewhere in Shenzhen or somewhere else, or died in a factory making products for American citizens. And we all know the stories of these people, just as we knew the stories of the heroic teachers during the Virginia Tech shooting, the teacher who barricaded himself against the door to try to prevent the gunman from killing more students. And we know that because journalists did their job, because they made human the loss. And it's why events like Boston profoundly affect all of us. It's not just because we're reacting out of fear or anger, it's also because it's our own people. We see them as our people that have been killed or injured or lost their legs. If we had that kind of media coverage of people like Abdulrahman al-Awlaki when he dies, and you see his humanity, and you look at the pictures of him, and you know what he wanted to be when he grew up, or you look at the real widows of Baghdad and spend more time focusing on them than the real housewives of New York and what Pinot Grigio they're drinking. If we actually realized the humanity in people and stopped viewing the world through the lens of Americans and everyone else, this wouldn't continue. Only until we have the courage to be empathetic enough to realize that our lives are not worth more than the lives of people from around the world, none of this is going to change. So the challenge we have before us is to realize that our real principles are tested. Who we really are as people, what we actually believe, what kind of society we want to build, what kind of policies we want being implemented in our name. Those principles are tested in a far more real way when someone that you like is in power, or that you may have voted for, or that you see as the lesser of two evils, or that is being portrayed as the guy who can wage a smarter war. Your ability to have a stiff spine in those moments is worth far more than what you do when someone like Bush and Cheney are in power. It's easy to be anti-war when those kinds of people are in power. But if it's a principle and not just serving a political party or ceding your conscience to a politician, then you're going to stand firm in those principles regardless of who happens to be living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's when your principles matter. And so I thank those of you from Peace Action and other groups that are here. I'm honored to be with you, sir, with a veteran of the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank you for what you've done and what you continue to do. And I'm also honored to receive this award in the name of Dorothy Eldridge, who was a great hero. Thank you very much. Okay. No one has to buy a book either. I can just talk to
The,
people there.
I know that everybody here looks forward to the question and answer period. Unfortunately, Jeremy did such a good job of telling us so much about what's going on in the world that we don't have time for that. I know that that's a great disappointment, but I hope that you'll step over to the area in that back corner, stop and buy a book. He says you don't have to buy a book, but
If you just have a question or something too, I'm happy to just.
You're allowed to ask him a question, but I say you got to buy a book. He doesn't say you got to buy a book. Anyway, so step over there and talk to him in informal communication. And the last thing we have to do today is introduce Margaret Pinsky to talk to us about who won the raffle on the 50/50. Huh? We always ask Margaret to do that because she's the youngest and most innocent looking among us. She doesn't want to believe that, but it's true. Give us a ticket, won't you, please?
The winning ticket of the 50/50 raffle is 2215508. Again, the winning ticket of the 50/50 raffle is 2215508. If you have this ticket, oh
my goodness.
One more thing I'd like to mention. There has been an earring found. If you are missing an earring, please come over to the main desk. That's where it will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, for making this such a successful event. Thank you very much for showing this energy. Thank you for all you do for Peace Action. Let us move forward.